Today, the program Dialogues Without Frontiers has the honor to receive Professor Neil Silberman. Welcome, Professor Silberman.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Professor Silberman is a well-known archaeologist, heritage officer. He's professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He was trained also as archaeologist in the Near East in the Hebrew University. He has been working on heritage issues with international organizations such as the UNESCO and the Organization of American States. And he's in Brazil lecturing on the subject of heritage and particularly on public archaeology. So the subject today of our show is public archaeology. So we should start with this simple question. What is public archaeology?
Well, I think that, as you know well, public archaeology is an attempt to change archaeology and engage more with people and communities. For so many years, archaeology was really a scientific endeavor by very few scholars going to places all around the world. The image of Indiana Jones and so forth. But the problem with that kind of archaeology is, however exciting the discoveries were, they were either taken back or really could only be understood by the scholars themselves. So public archaeology is an attempt to involve the public not only in learning about archaeology, but also in participating in the search for more information about the past.
And are people interested and open to participate in these kinds of schemes, like communities? So is it easy for archaeologists or for scholars to deal with the community? What do you think?
Well, I think that it really depends on how the public archaeologists deal with the community. If the aim of a particular archaeologist is just to educate the community in the kind of archaeology that they do, that really has no connection to their lives, to teach them facts about the past or artifacts, there's often not much enthusiasm.
It's boring.
It's boring. It doesn't have anything to do with their lives. It's not relevant. So that maybe a very few will, but if the archaeologist has the intention not only of educating the community in their own archaeology, but in trying to find some way that the community can find its own identity in the archaeology, then it's almost always a real excitement from the communities to be included in this work.
And when was it established, this kind of approach, this kind of inclusive approach to archaeology?
Well, yeah, I think that, as archaeology began to get more and more esoteric and more technical, there was a natural feeling among archaeologists, and certainly those that fund them, that they really weren't contributing enough to the societies that were funding them. So particularly in the cases of archaeologists that work for governments and so forth, I would say probably in the 1980s or 1990s, the idea came that in addition to doing their own research, archaeologists should give something back to the communities that they're working in.
And there is then a relationship between this kind of innovative approach of inclusion of communities and heritage management?
Yeah, I think that there are major changes also in heritage management, because it was always very much separated. That archaeologists would do their work, or historians would do their work, then they would leave, and then you would have government officials that would come in and put signs and fences and so forth and create what is official heritage. But at the same time that the archaeologists were recognizing that they had to give something back to the communities, I think more and more government departments, specifically those dealing with culture, recognized that there was culture in the communities, and that some way or another, it wasn't just a matter of people visiting, buying a ticket, or going to a site with a fence around it, that they had to be included much more. So from the research stage to the commemoration stage, the community started to become included much more.
And another related challenge has to do with tourism.
Yes.
Because a lot of tourism is concerned with archaeological sites or heritage sites in general, and this can have a very large impact in the community. So what's the possible contribution of a critical approach to the subject, the inclusion of the community?
I think that it's getting to be really, really necessary, because whether it is communities or government officials or even archaeologists themselves, there is this myth that any site can become a tourist attraction. That if money is invested in a particular site, the tourists will come. And more than that the tourists will come and their visits will stimulate the local economy. So all over the world, archaeological sites and historical sites are being turned in to essentially to tourist attractions, to attract people from the outside. And there are some serious problems with this approach. First of all, there's the whole economic problem, because often the myth or the promise or the expectation doesn't come in reality, and the tourists don't come. And a community, often a community with serious economic problems, is investing its money in a tourist site and no tourists come, then it really is a major disappointment and a major cost. But even when they do come, there are sometimes very harmful effects.
What kind of effects?
Well, in the sense that, you know, everyone thinks about the tourist dollars coming in. But the governments, first of all, the governments have to pay for the costs that aren't included. More traffic, more public services, more police, cleaning up the trash and so forth. And these are often the responsibility of the government, not the people who are running the site. In addition, there's a very subtle but very important effect, and that is that the people in the community, especially those that are near tourist centers, begin to think of their heritage as a business. And so they assume that their own heritage is essentially for outsiders. And they may have jobs there and so forth, but in the evening they go away, and it's no longer their heritage. And this is a really crucial problem, because we're finding more and more that memory and identification and some sense of belonging is a very important social component. And when tourism turns heritage sites into businesses or shows for outsiders, the local community suffers a kind of alienation from their own possession of the heritage.
And is it possible to have some kind of scheme so that the community or the people in the community can cooperate with scholars and with administrators, so that the managers, so that they can have some kind of cooperation in the management of a specific site or a specific monument or whatever? What are the experiences internationally on this sphere?
Yes. This is another area where public archaeology and public heritage is really developing some new approaches. Just as with science, the administration of heritage was always from the top down. That the people in the capital, the people in the museum decided what was important and what was significant, and the people would either agree or they would just ignore what was there. But increasingly, in the work that I've been a part of in Europe, in the United States, in the Caribbean, in the Middle East even, the idea is that maybe a good way to deal with the heritage, to ensure that the community feels a part of it, is to involve them from the beginning in trying to find out what is significant to the community. Now, obviously, it's not just a question of you ask the community and whatever they want to do. If they want a Disneyland, if they want a McDonald's, it's all fine. It's a question of the heritage professionals who used to be completely in charge having a structured framework for consultation and discussion and reflection, so that the people of a community are encouraged not only to manage the sites, but even to decide as a community which sites are most important to them.
So they can have some kind of influence, for example, in determining the list of valuable things for the community and so on and so forth.
Yes, a major change in heritage has been recognizing that it's not, heritage does not consist only of natural wonders and very prominent archaeological sites or monuments. It also includes intangible things like food and song and music and vernacular architecture. What is most common and typical of a place instead of what is outstanding. So often the engagement of the community in bringing forth ideas of what's important to them actually helps the government recognize how great the resources are, far more than they would identify themselves.
And do you think that our colleagues, I mean, the scholars in general, archaeologists, heritage managers, and other people involved with this process,
yes,
if they are convinced of the importance of working with the community, because we are trained as scholars to be very much focused on a very specific subject, to know everything about a very small detail, and nothing about anything else. So what's your impression about the change in the education, learning of the scholars themselves?
I think that you have absolutely indicated the biggest problem, that the scholars that are working in the field understand that there are problems out there of a decreasing interest in the public in archaeology, all kinds of different ideas about the past that are drawn from films and from books and comics and popular culture of all kinds, and that's fine. But as you say, the scholars that are working today have been trained in very narrow subjects of excavation, of identification of artifacts. And to really do this job of community involvement, you have to have an education that is much broader than that includes economics and sociology and community management of various kinds. And I think that it's really up to the younger generations of archaeologists to begin to have a much broader view of all the components. It's not only about the past. An archaeological excavation or a heritage site exists in the present, and it's surrounded by the social and economic problems of the present. And so the challenge for archaeologists is to broaden the curriculum of how they train their students.
So that you are saying that archaeologists should also be concerned with present and future issues. So not only look to the past, but also to the present and future. That's a new concept.
Yes, I mean, I think that this idea of using heritage as a guide to communities understanding where they are in history and where they're headed in history is as important as knowing about the past. Often the sole view on the past is used to either make the past seem more attractive than the present, or in a sense to make the present seem inevitable and eternal. And the involvement of communities in archaeology and heritage, in creating new places, in having their own desires and traditions and their own identities included, is going to make the society of the future. So the idea of remembering forward is an entirely new orientation for public archaeology and heritage.
So that this is a challenge to be coped with in the formation of the new generations of scholars and other interested people.
Yes.
And do you think that the publications for the general public are reflecting this kind of new approach? I mean, books aimed at the general audience on heritage or archaeology, are they aware of this community involvement, or still very much describing the past as a romantic past, some kind of, as you said, an idealized view of the past, so that the present is inevitable and we should accept the social order and the status quo?
I think that you're absolutely right. I think that the popular press is behind the development of what's happening in society. And I've often said that there are probably 5 journalistic stories about archaeology. Buried treasure, a myth is true, a myth is not true. You know, the Indiana Jones syndrome that sees the past as a kind of entertainment. And that really robs us of understanding that the past, like personal memory, is a very important thing to have. And so I'm hoping that we can move beyond those 5 stories and make the past a part of the present again.
Well, this could lead us to a very controversial issue relating to conflicts, because societies are made up of different social classes and different people with different ideas, ideologies, or interests, and even more so if we compare different peoples and in contact. So the challenge is how to work with communities when we know that there are so many conflicts and contradictions within society itself.
It's a really important problem now as the world is getting much more interconnected. Maybe not more peaceful, in fact maybe even more conflicted, because heritage itself, and archaeology also, is almost by its nature conflictual, because it defines what is ours and makes a sort of boundary between what is ours, what is our heritage, and what is someone else's. And in cities all over the world, people are moving, and there are all kinds of classes, ethnic groups, immigrants, local people, each of whom has their own idea of what is theirs, and everything else is somehow outside. It doesn't belong to them. So this kind of conflict brings up not only a kind of patriotism and chauvinism for our heritage, but it also makes the heritage of other people something to attack, something to put graffiti on, something to damage or destroy in cases of war. And this new approach with communities is very much about dialogue, that people must first recognize that heritage is sort of a human right, that every kind of group has the right to see their own identity as they wish to see it. And when you begin to include more people, then the us becomes a much larger us. And some of the conflicts can be dealt with very simply by just treating people with dignity, bringing them to a table. And I've even had experience in Israel and Palestine where you think these are two peoples that are completely at war, bringing them together and asking what is shared about their heritage. You begin to get common attitudes toward the environment, toward agriculture, toward cities, toward common things. And I think that the problem of conflict, which is very serious, can be addressed by finding what people share, a shared heritage, rather than what separates them.
So that even most difficult subjects, like for example in the Middle East, a community approach is useful, as you mentioned.
Yes.
And in the case of this, to conclude our talk, you consider that in the case of the United States and Brazil, where we have Indians and colonizers, so there is this kind of disjunction. How to deal with this disjunction? Because people consider that they are from outside.
Yes.
And so that the indigenous peoples are underestimated.
I think that they're underestimated and sometimes romanticized as unchanging in some way. And indigenous people are as human as any other kind of people. And this is where the whole theme of remembering forward comes in. It's not so much only a question of heritage rights. Everyone has heritage rights, but they also have responsibilities. And the responsibility deals with understanding that indigenous, native-born, and immigrant are building a society for the future. And it's not a question of choosing one over the other. It's a question of creating a new heritage together that allows everyone to see the heritage of everyone else in the society is part of their own heritage as well.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Professor Silberman.
My pleasure.
It has been a pleasure for us, and I'm sure that our audience will enjoy very much this new approach to the subject. So thanks very much for coming to our show. And I invite everybody to the next issue of our program.